Hi there, in this video we're going to be exploring how athletes actually train before the big competition. My name is Steve Ingham and welcome to the Scorching Champions YouTube channel, in which we're going to be exploring performance strategies to help your fitness and your sports performance, your team working and your productivity. So in this video, I'm going to explore the amount, the volume, and the manner in which an athlete manages how they start to lead into a big competition. This is actually going to be in a little series of videos. So the first one's going to focus on the amount of training that athletes do. The second is going to be about the intensity. And then the third video is going to be all about some of those unexpected changes that happen in the lead up to a big competition. So preparing to perform is a big topic. But what I'm going to do is draw out a couple of specific observations, and I'm going to share with you some of my applied observations about some of the perspectives that we hadn't read about, hadn't heard about, but we started to observe and we started to work with athletes to develop them. I'm also going to hone it in and focus on how do you perform for the big competition, because sustaining performance I think is a separate topic for another session, another day. The other thing is that there's a big performance gain to be had. Is that roughly speaking, what we know from the peaking and tapering literature is that you can improve your performance from 0 to 6%. And in fact, actually, that doesn't really do it justice. You can deteriorate performance quite a bit. And I'll talk through a couple of dynamics that I think are really interesting about when people peak. And that in itself can offer us an opportunity to maximize performance. So a quick story for you then. After the Sydney Olympics, we were all getting together as sports scientists and sharing and comparing notes about looking at what worked, what did we observe, how did it feel, and a bit of peer support. And the sports scientists in the sailing team shared a nice little story that leads into our first principle of athlete preparation. And he'd been working with one of his top performers, and the performer had come back and started to talk a little bit about different types of strategies, but they'd asked them about performance strategies just before the Olympics. And this athlete had tapped the sports scientist on the shoulder and said, "Oh, what's this about an athlete peaking, tapering, dropping training down? That's really interesting. Maybe I should be doing one of those." And the sports scientist just looked around and quite bluntly just said, "You're not fit enough for one of those." And so that actually leads us into our first principle, is that and I'll allude to the second principle now so it will make sense, is that the second principle is about how you drop down your training in the lead up to competition. But it's important for us to recognize that what athletes do before they drop the training down. So what athletes will tend to do is put a body of work together. They call it a work camp of 3 to 6 weeks in duration. Sometimes athletes will go to altitude to try and boost the effect. But really all that really adds up is that's a stimulus from which you adapt. You'll hear me talk about this principle time and time again, is that training is a stimulus. It's a mechanical and metabolic stimulus from which you're asking the body to adapt. The body will sort of go, okay, right, that hurt, that training was intense. Okay, I'm now going to put new systems in place. If you do that again, it's not going to disturb my body as much. So really what we're looking for here is what's called a supercompensatory effect. So as the work camp starts to progress and as you start to sort of push athletes harder and harder into deeper fatigue, what you're trying to do is intensify the stimulus for the body to adapt and change. And so what you tend to do is you feel fatigued and you start to really dig in and graft through the work camp. And then as you release the training volume, then you get a bounce back. It's sort of almost an overcompensatory effect. The body is really going, okay, if you're going to push me that hard, then I'm going to put amazing new systems in place to advance your performance. But the body's protective system is really interested in just looking after itself. So if you're going to keep pushing me like this, then I'm going to toughen the system up. And that's really what fitness and growth is all about. This is definitely a balancing act though, because if you go too hard, if you push the body into too much of a deep fatigue state, then the body doesn't necessarily bounce back and it can almost just go flat. And this is called sort of maladaptation. It could be that actually it gets worse, it just stays worse. And so as that freeing and release of training comes on, then you've got a bit of a problem. It hasn't really adapted. brilliant physiologist called Kate Spilsbury did her PhD with us, and she explored tapering. And she developed a number of different tapering models in her research, how it can work under different circumstances, whether it's continuous volume, actually reducing the tapering, reducing the frequency, all these sorts of different models. And what she found as one of the common characteristics that really dominates as a presiding factor is this idea of what you do, the volume you do before the actual taper kicks in. So it's important to recognise that that's an important aspect, even though we start to get interested in the performance gain as the taper starts to drop down. Another little story from the rowing team, again, the Sydney Olympics, because this is an interesting one where people were sort of experimenting and trying out different regimes in the British system for the first time. So when I was working with the rowing team, working with the women's team, this is the women's quad. This was Gillian Lindsay, Katherine Grainger, Miriam and Guin Batten in a quad boat. And they arrived in Australia at the Gold Coast holding camp. And I sat down with them and they'd just come off their work camp. And they said, Steve, it was just so intense. We've never worked so hard in our lives. The amount of work that we did was crazy. At one point, we were even looking at the program and thinking that the lunch hour was missing. I said, okay, well, tell me about how much work you did, and we captured that training volume. And then I asked them, okay, but how are you feeling? And they said, well, we're tired, but we're actually okay. We actually feel all right. And at that point, I thought, okay, this could spell a real performance boost, a real adaptation, super compensation during that tapering camp. Because if you can get the balance right where you're working hard, as you then start to release the training volume, then you can get some real gains. And as it was that they did, as the tapering camp started to proceed, that they really started to fly, and performance came, and they went on to win an Olympic silver medal. Okay, the next principle is the actual taper phase. So this is about a reduction in training in the lead up to competition, and it's an alleviation of fatigue. So it means that the athlete can experience this supercompensation and perform at their peak. There are some individual considerations to be made, and certainly athletes will find their way as to what works for them. But typically what you'll see, about 10 to 14 days the taper will begin. That's 10 to 14 days before the big competition. And as a rough guideline, what you'll see is actually an alleviation of the training volume during that period of 40 to 60%, roughly speaking, about half the training volume. Typically during this time, you'll see changes in hormonal profile, so you'll see increases in testosterone, reductions in cortisol. You might see an expansion in blood volume. You might see an expansion in the amount of glycogen or carbohydrates stored within the muscle strength, muscle power, increases in oxidative enzyme concentration, so how efficient your muscles are working aerobically. It appears as though how you reduce the amount of training that you're doing actually matters. And so there's different ways in which athletes have done that over the years, and ones that have been actually tested and experimentally, we've got an idea which one's more or less superior. First technique that people use is just a step, so actually a sudden reduction in the amount, and that's just held at a constant level. Another fashion is a linear reduction, so you've got an inverse relationship between sort of time versus amount performed, and actually you're just dripping that down slowly but surely. The other is to use what's called an exponential or a decay-based response. And there's two different options here, a slow decay or a fast decay. So slow, where actually you're alleviating the training relatively slowly, or you're actually alleviating it relatively quickly. All right, most important thing is if you're an athlete and you're about to go into a big competition and you're watching this and you're thinking, I don't do it like that, then what you need to recognize is probably the plan that you are going to follow, the one that's prescribed by your coaches, is the one that's going to best suit you. And the reason for that is what you don't want to be doing is trying something new immediately before a big competition. The plan that you've tested is the most assured and is probably going to give you the biggest improvement in performance. And if you're interested in changing your taper around, do that in years to come. Do that after the big competition and start getting into exploring it. Whether it's step, linear, fast or slow decay, the main point here is that you're allowing rest to predominate and you're freeing the work and you're allowing the body's processes to rest, recover, and then bounce back and adapt. So the main message from today's video is really all about, if we're expecting peak performance to happen, we're going to have to put the work in beforehand. But we must make sure that we're dropping down the amount that we're doing so that we're actually staying fresh for when it matters. The next video in the series is going to be all about using intensity before we compete. And one of the things that intensity can do is avoid the mistake of peaking at the wrong time before we compete. It can also provide us with an awful lot of readiness mentally. If that sounds interesting to you, then consider subscribing to the channel to stay tuned. Thanks for watching.